Last week, we started a new series that we're calling The Island of Misfit Toys. And many of you were in the camp with me who knew exactly what I was talking about when it comes to the Misfit Toys. You knew exactly what that was. You were with me. You also affirmed me in showing some of the staff that haven't seen that movie that they're crazy. Like, you affirmed me in that. So I need to just let you know about something that happened this week. Some of those staff members told me that the way I set that up to you, they said I set it up in a way that would make you automatically agree with me and that I was stacking the deck in my favor. And to that I said, absolutely, of course I did that. Of course I did that. So to be fair to them and to level the playing field, we had a different argument in our offices this week, okay? And it was an argument that ended up having most of the staff look at me and think that I'm crazy. So here's what was going on. We had Christmas music playing in our offices, and the song, I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, came up. Okay, this is where the debate started. So I'm just gonna ask you straight up so that I don't tip my hand at all. I'm just gonna ask you first. In that song, I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, who do you think Santa is in that song? The dad, okay, the dad. Never one time in my life did I think it was the dad. Never have I thought that it was the dad in that song. Never, ever. And so they're looking at me like I'm crazy. And they're thinking, of course, Matt, of course it's the dad. It's this cute little song. This kid sees Santa, but it's really daddy kissing mommy. That's cute. Matt, who did you think Santa was in that song? And I said, a homewrecker. That's who Santa is in that song. He's a homewrecker, and now this poor child has trauma around Christmas every year for the rest of his or her life because one year when they were 6 years old, he or she came down the stairs and saw mommy kissing some creepy old dude. Like, that song has always just creeped me out. Kelly Follett was with me on this. If you know Kelly, she's on our kids team, but the rest of the staff, they thought that we were crazy. Like, my Christmas worldview was just blown this past week. Like, I've never, ever liked that song, and maybe now you think I'm crazy too. And the same condescending judgment I showed some of the staff last week for not seeing Rudolph, well, I want you to know what goes around comes around. Because now I'm looked at as the misfit. I'm just living this series out. And the Christmas story is much more like the island of misfit toys than it is some picture-perfect story where everyone's got everything else together. See, you all have been deceived and you thought that mommy kissing Santa Claus was daddy. It's not that story. There's much more to it. But what we tend to do is we tend to think that the Christmas story is for everyone else because everyone else has their life put together, but not me. And nobody else can relate to what's going on with you. Nobody else is experiencing the pain you are. Nobody else has a story that can relate to yours. So it's really easy to feel like you're an outsider looking in. Because we do a really, really good job of comparing ourselves to other people. But all that does is end up leading to more discouragement. And the reason why is you're comparing yourself to something, the things about other people's story that they let you see. That's what you're comparing yourself to. Social media is a great example of this. People are only posting the top 2% of their lives. Like, that's it. They're just letting you see the good stuff. But you look at the things that they posted, or that vacation that they just posted, or those rewards their kids got, or the award that they were given, or that promotion they got, or those engagement pictures. It's really easy for you to start thinking, wow, that must be 100% of what their life is like. Even though you know that's not true, you're gonna start thinking it and wonder, like, why does my life not look like that? Or whenever you go up and greet someone and you ask them how they're doing, and they're like, we're doing great, with this big smile on their face. And in the back of your head, you immediately think, well, I'm not great. Everything in my life isn't great. Why is my life not great like their life? Or family pictures. Like, if you ever get a Christmas card, whenever you get Christmas cards, they always look fantastic, don't they? You look at them and you're like, man, their family's got it all put together. Look how great he or she looks. Look how angelic and obedient their kids are. What's that like? That must be nice. And then your family picture looks something like this. Like, that's real life. Like, that's how family pictures really go. Every year I ask Kelly if we can make this our Christmas card. She always rolls her eyes and like, no, we can't do that. So I'm going to show it to you right now. I mean, this is my favorite family picture of ours. Like, Christmas can be the great comparison, can't it? It's really easy to compare yourself to other people and other stories right now. But if you compare yourself during this time of year, what it's going to do is it's going to make you feel more isolated, more alone, and it's going to make you feel like an outsider because what you're comparing to is not the full story. You're only getting part of it from other people. The same thing is true of the Christmas story. It's not just Jesus in a manger with Mary and Joseph, some shepherds, some wise men, that's it. It's not just the nativity scene. Not at all. There's so much more to it. Matthew 1 is the beginning of the Christmas story, and it starts off with genealogy, Jesus' family tree. So there's so many other stories that make up this Christmas story. And when you look at Jesus' genealogy, we got into this last week. When you look at it, some of those stories you wouldn't expect the King of Kings to have in his line. I mean, there's some stuff that makes you go, ugh, that's beyond rated R. In Jesus' family tree, you have kings and there are criminals. There is success and there is utter failure. There is murder and there is sacrifice. There's commitment and there's sexual deviance. There are insiders and there are outsiders. And one of the outsiders is in Matthew 1:5. It says Solomon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. And then Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Her story gets told in a 4-chapter book in the Old Testament. Some of you know her story. It's a pretty legit story. Like Ruth is one of the very few people in the Bible where you look at her and you look at her story and you think, she's pretty legit. She didn't do dumb stuff like a lot of other people did. She doesn't have this glaring fatal flaw. She wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But when you look at Ruth, you're looking at, man, that's a pretty good model to follow after. But that's not how she would have been seen in her day at all. In fact, when Matthew writes this in the first century, when he writes down this genealogy, there would have been a lot of Jews in the first century that would have been pretty shocked to see her name in Jesus' genealogy. Number one, because she's a woman, and women were almost never included in Jewish genealogy back then. But the bigger reason, number two, was because Ruth was a particular outsider that the Israelites did not like and did not want around. She was a Moabite. Now, Moab was a nation that was started from an incestuous relationship. Not a great start. There was a guy named Lot, Abraham's nephew, if you know Abraham. Well, Lot gets drunk one night, and his 2 daughters decide to sleep with him. And if you're thinking, that sounds messed up, you would be right. That's as messed up as it gets. And both of these daughters end up getting pregnant. And one of the sons is named Moab. Moab turns into this big nation and quickly becomes enemies with Israel. I mean, there was not a whole lot of love lost between the two of these nations. Moab tried to curse Israel. They tried to destroy Israel. When Israel was leaving Egypt and going to the promised land, they asked for help. They're like, hey, can we pass through? We'll buy any food or water that we need. And Moab's like, no, you can't even come in near us. Like these guys were rivals from the get-go. Deuteronomy 23:3 says this is God talking. He says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants for 10 generations may be admitted into the assembly of the Lord. I'm just trying to paint the picture. These two people groups, they did not like each other. The Israelites did not like Moab, and that's exactly where Ruth is from. So here's the story. It was taking place during the time when the judges ruled over Israel. So Judges is the book in the Old Testament that's right before Ruth. And at the very end of the book, it tells you what's happening. In Judges 21:25, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and all of the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. Does that sound familiar to you at all? People doing what's right in their own eyes. Well, for them, it resulted in a lot of idolatry and some pretty violent stuff. If you read through Judges, it's a lot of violence. But the context is so similar to ours today. For us, it's the combination of postmodernism and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So when you take postmodernism and let it remove truth and remove any objective standard for morality, then you combine that with the top need in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is self-actualization. We as a society have bought into those things hardcore. Well, if you take self-actualization as the highest need and you combine that with no truth and no standard for morality, of course you're going to get people doing whatever's right in their own eyes. And for us, it results in the same thing. There's all kinds of idolatry today. It's not little statues, but there's all different kinds of idolatry, and there's all kind of violence today too, isn't there? It's the same context. We have the exact same context. The details are different. For them, there was a severe famine. There was a severe famine in Israel, and there was this guy named Elimelech. Elimelech was married to a woman named Naomi, and they had 2 sons. They were from Bethlehem. Well, they leave Bethlehem to go to Moab hoping to find food because the famine was that bad. It's that bad that they would be willing to go to Moab. And they go there, and when they settle down in Moab, they're there for about 10 years. Well, their 2 sons, they marry Moabite women. One of them was a girl named Ruth. Things are going well for a while, and then eventually Elimelech and his 2 sons, they die. Now, this is really bad news for Naomi and her 2 daughter-in-laws, because back then, women were not allowed to inherit property from their husband. That wasn't allowed. So what would happen would be, if I died, my property that I owned would all go to my sons, and then my sons would be responsible for taking care of my wife, their mother. That was the custom back then. The problem was, Naomi lost both. Her husband's dead, and so are her sons. So this is about as bad as it gets in that time period, in that culture for a woman. Basically, here's what's going to happen to her. Either she's going to face extreme poverty, prostitution, or something worse. Those are her options. So Naomi decides to leave. She's going to go back to Bethlehem. She heard that there's food there now, and it's much better to be in her homeland than to be here in Moab. So she tells her 2 daughter-in-laws, hey, you need to go back to your families. Like, I have nothing for you. You have no hope with me. You're still young enough that you can go back, you can remarry, and then you're going to have a secure future. But Ruth looks at her mother-in-law and says, how can I? I can't leave. Where you go, I go. Where you live, I live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I mean, incredible dedication to another person. Like, even though they have nothing and they have no plan, Ruth is just trying to figure out, I got to take care of her somehow. Because this situation for Naomi is as bad as it gets because she's too old in this culture to remarry. She's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I have no hope. But you know what? I'm going to try to take care of her. I'm not going to abandon her. So Ruth chooses faithfulness over security. Now, she knows in the back of her head that she's giving up any security that she could ever possibly find, that she's giving up any chance for a future just to stick with Naomi. So they leave and they go back to Bethlehem. And when they get there, they're homeless. They got nothing. And Ruth tells Naomi, hey, I'm going to go glean out in one of the wheat fields. Because whenever there was a harvest in a wheat field, any grain that was dropped on the ground during a harvest had to be left there. So even if you owned the field and you dropped grain during the harvest, by law, you were not allowed to pick it up. The reason why was that was an opportunity to allow anyone who was poor to come in and pick up that grain. That's what gleaning was. Pick up that grain, and now they've got some food. It was kind of like a welfare program. This is what Ruth goes out and does. She goes out to glean in this field. And the field she goes to is owned by a guy named Boaz. It's a pretty strong name, isn't it? Boaz. Boaz was an influential guy, very well respected. And he sees Ruth out in the field gleaning, and he says to some of his guys, he's like, hey, who's that? And they're like, oh, that's the Moabite girl that came back with Naomi. And Boaz is like, that's her? So he goes out to her. He's heard about her. He goes out to her and he says, hey, Ruth, stay in my field. Don't go to any other fields. And I've told all the men not to mess with you. He's protecting her because a young widowed foreign woman was about as vulnerable as it gets in the ancient world. It's still pretty vulnerable today. It was really bad back then. And then he gives her some food. He lets her eat right then and there and then gives her a bunch of extra food to take home with her, to take wherever Naomi's at. And this is just so unprecedented. A foreign woman would have expected to be chased off at best, most likely assaulted or something even worse. Like, she never would have thought, I'm going to be protected, I'm going to be allowed to stay, and I'm also going to be given food. That never would have crossed any of their minds. So Ruth is like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you being so kind to me? I'm just an outsider. And Boaz says, I know. But I also know and I've seen and I've heard about the faithfulness and the kindness that you've shown to your mother-in-law even after your husband died. I know that you gave up any chance for security for yourself. I know that you gave up any hope for a future. You're incredibly kind. So Ruth takes all this food and she goes back to Naomi and she tells him about this guy named Boaz. And Naomi is just floored. Ruth doesn't know why. She's like, yeah, I thought he was a great guy too. This is so nice. He was pretty good looking, but why are you so excited? And Naomi's like, you don't even know. Like, you don't even know what this means. Back then, in that time period, in that culture, there was something called a kinsman redeemer. So if a man died, if he had a male relative who was alive and willing, that male relative could then marry his widowed wife in order to protect her and care for her and also carry on her dead husband's name. Kind of weird to us, but that was a big deal back then. Boaz happened to be in that line to be a kinsman redeemer for them. That's a big deal. So if he would end up marrying Ruth, that would take Naomi into her house also and care for her. This way they aren't going to have to face the hardship that's going to come for a widow in that time period. It was a way to redeem them from the pain of loss that they've already suffered. So Naomi says to Ruth, okay, here's what you do. Go out to the field, because this is the harvest time. They're going to be out there all day and night working. They'll sleep out there. Find where Boaz is sleeping, and when you find him, go up and lie down next to his feet. Take some of the blanket that's covering his feet and cover yourself up with it. Again, sounds a little creepy to us. Ladies, if you're trying to get him to commit, don't do it. It sounds kind of weird. It's not going to go in your favor. But this was a big deal for them. So Ruth does it. She goes out into the field. She finds where Boaz is sleeping, and she lays down at his feet, takes some of the blanket off of his feet, which would have upset me right away. I don't like it if my feet are cold, but puts the blanket then onto herself. When Boaz wakes up in the next morning, when he wakes up the next morning, like he's freaked out at first because there's a strange woman sleeping at his feet who wasn't there the night before. I think we would all react like that. But then he sees who it is. Ruth wasn't thinking about herself first. She was thinking about Naomi. Because if Boaz marries Ruth, that means he'll take Naomi in also, which means Naomi will be cared for and taken care of, which was the whole reason Ruth stuck with her in the first place. Boaz looks down and sees that it's Ruth. He knows exactly what she's doing. By laying at his feet, she's symbolizing her dependence on him, and she's asking him, without even saying it, she's asking him to step into his role as the Redeemer if he's willing. So Boaz sees this. He knows that's what she's saying because he's already thought about it himself. He says, Ruth, your kindness just gets better and better and better. I know you're not thinking about yourself. Like, your loyalty is incredible. I want you to know that I've already thought about this. And you don't have to worry. I will marry you. And then he goes through a couple cultural details. He does marry Ruth. They do bring Naomi into their home, take care of her. Like, crisis avoided. They're not going to face extreme poverty or worse. But the story doesn't stop there. In fact, it's actually still going. Ruth and Boaz, they have a son. And they name him Obed. And he became the father of Jesse, the grandfather of David. That's King David. The same David that Jesus would come from. So this young, widowed, foreign girl who was a complete outsider, who was a misfit in the eyes of everybody around her, this girl who had no future, no security, no hope at all, she ends up becoming the great-grandmother of the greatest king in the history of Israel. Jesus comes from Ruth's line. Like, never in a million years would Ruth or Naomi ever dream that anything like that could have ever happened. But this story it's not about Ruth. This story is actually about how God works behind the scenes. So no matter how antagonistic or discouraging or chaotic the world seems, God is working in ways that you might not be able to see, and you may not even be able to understand, at least not yet. That should be comforting to us and encouraging at the least. Like, sometimes it's really apparent, you can see what God's doing, you can see him working, and then there's other times where you don't at all. But he is working behind the scenes. It's not a coincidence that they were from Bethlehem and then went back to Bethlehem. That's not a coincidence at all. That's fulfilling scripture. David was going to be born there, and then Jesus was supposed to be born there, which he was. This was God setting all of this up. Not coincidence at all. God's working behind the scenes. It's not a coincidence that Ruth showed up in Boaz's field. Out of all of the fields in and around Bethlehem, I've been there. There's lots of them. She just happens to show up in the one field that's owned by the guy who can be a kinsman redeemer. That's not a coincidence at all. God was working behind the scenes. It's not a coincidence that Boaz did marry her, that they did have a son, and that son becomes the grandfather of David. None of that is a coincidence. God was working behind the scenes. Ruth's story proves it. That's why she's mentioned in Matthew 1. That's why she's mentioned at the very beginning of the Christmas story, because God is always working behind the scenes, whether we realize it or not. I had lunch this week with a friend of mine that I greatly respect. He's incredibly wise and humble. He's one of those guys where you're just like, man, I want to be more like you. He was talking to me about this human construct that psychologists have identified and they talk about. It's this construct of four things that every individual person is looking for and needs. Here they are. Number one, everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to feel secure. Everyone wants to feel safe. And everyone wants to be soothed. Those are the four. Seen, safe, secure, and soothed. And as you talk through those with me, I'm like, yeah. And that's legit. Even if you were like, no, I don't need that. Yeah, you do. Like all of us want those four things. And then I started thinking about Ruth, like her story. Those four things, she had none of them. She wasn't seen or safe because she was an outsider. She wasn't secure or soothed because her husband died. But God was working behind the scenes to give her all of those things. Like even though she wasn't seen because she was an outsider, she wasn't seen by the world around her, her faithfulness and kindness was seen. Boaz saw it. He knew about it. And the same thing is true for you. The same thing is true for me. Your reputation right now is being formed by the people who are watching you. And there are people that are watching you. And if you are consistently doing the right thing at the right time, that creates a great reputation for you. Living out good values, good qualities, that creates a great reputation. It did for Ruth and it did for Boaz. They had amazing reputations. Some of you might not have one though. And I get that. Here's the good news though. Today is another chance for you to change your reputation. Like if you are consistently doing the right thing at the right time, that will create such a great reputation for you, and you have no idea how God will use that in ways that it'll just blow your mind. That was Ruth and that was Boaz. 2 Chronicles 16:9 talks about this. It says, the eyes of the Lord search. I'm not seen. The eyes of the Lord search the whole earth in order to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. You may not think that you are seen by other people around you at all. Like you may just think, I might as well be a ghost. I'm invisible. Nobody sees me. And that might be true. Except God does see you. He absolutely sees you. There's so many different names that describe God throughout the Old Testament. You know, you've got I am, Jehovah, Yahweh, El Shaddai. Well, another name that's given to God in the Old Testament is El Roi. El Roi. And it means the God who sees. And you want to know the first place that ever comes up? It's said by an outsider woman who was being treated harshly. It's Genesis 16. So no matter who you are and no matter what your story is, God sees you. If you're alone, God sees you. If you feel isolated, God sees you. If you're hurting, God sees you. If you're ashamed, God sees you. If you're faithful, God sees you. If you have a good reputation, God sees you. There is a God who sees you. You're not invisible. So then with Ruth, what about safety? Like how did God give her safety? Well, that was Boaz's protection. Hey, I told the other guys don't mess with you or they're going to have to mess with me. That was protection. It's a big deal. And that's just a microcosm of the protection that God will give us. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to face dangerous things in life. It doesn't mean that you won't experience pain or loss. It does not mean that you won't suffer. You absolutely will because we live in a broken world. But there are so many times throughout Scripture where God is described as either a fortress or a refuge or a shield. His protection is talked about over and over and over again. Classic verse, Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil because you are with me. Your staff and your rod, they protect me and they comfort me. Psalm 5, verse 11 says this. But let all who take refuge in you, God, rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them and those who love your name that they may exult in you. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover him with favor as with a shield. Now, I think this happens often. I've done this, and I'm sure you probably have, and this is a talking point that comes up all the time from our world, that, you know what, when bad stuff happens, when you experience pain or you lose something or there's suffering, whenever that happens, usually our first question is, where were you on that one, God? Is that fair? Maybe you've asked that before, or I bet you've heard other people ask that. Like, why didn't you stop this from happening? Like, why didn't you protect me from this? Why weren't you a shield on this one? And sometimes those questions are really valid. But I want to know, do we ask the reverse question? Like, do we ever ask God, hey, God, will you show me the things that you protected me from and they never happened, so I don't even know that they exist because you protected me? Like, God, are there things that I don't even know about because you were a shield for me, that you stopped, that you kept me safe from? Was there a car wreck that never happened because you intervened? That storm that was going to destroy a lot of things, it didn't happen because you stopped it. Or that cell that was in one of my loved ones that was about to metastasize, it never happened because you crushed it, and we know nothing of those things. Or what about the person who was actually going to do you harm and never happened, and you don't even know about it because God protected you? I've gotten a glimpse of this one time personally. It was years and years ago. Kelly and I are living in Indianapolis, and we were coming home one night late from a wedding, and we're driving through our neighborhood, and we lived in a huge neighborhood, so it wasn't uncommon at all to see lots of cars even in the middle of the night. And we're in the middle of the neighborhood driving back to our house, and I just looked in the rearview mirror, and there was another car behind us. Nothing weird, nothing suspicious, pretty common, but something didn't sit right with me. So we turned onto a side street, and that car turned on the same street. And then we turned onto the street that leads to our cul-de-sac, and so did that car. And then as soon as I pulled into our driveway, that car immediately shut down, stopped 2 houses down, and turned off its lights. Like, something felt off. Like, I honestly felt, I'm not this guy normally, I felt like we were being followed. So I just backed out of the driveway really quick to make them think that I was just turning around, and I drove slowly past that car, and there were 2 guys in the front seat, and they just stared straight ahead. So then I kind of gunned it a little bit to take off towards the end of the street, and as soon as I did that, they turned on their headlights, and they spun around and did a U-turn and came after us. So now the challenger in me came out. I did the same thing. I did a U-turn, and I wanted to come right back at them. And when I did that, they sped off. So I called the cops. I've never done that before. I'm not that kind of guy. And I was like, hey, I just want to report a suspicious vehicle. I think I was being followed. And I was following them out so I could get a license plate and a description. And they got out to the end of our neighborhood, and they turned onto a main street. By the time I got there, they were about a quarter mile down the road, and they'd already been pulled over. So I'm on the phone with dispatch, and I said, hey, actually, this car just got pulled over. If you want to let that officer know that it's at this intersection. And they're like, okay, great. Can we put you on hold? So I pass the car, and I go up about another 500 yards or so and just turn into another neighborhood and park. About 2 or 3 minutes go by, and they get back on the phone, and dispatch asks me for my contact information if they need to call and ask me some questions. And then they said, thank you. I'm like, thank you for what? And they said, well, we've actually been looking for that vehicle. We'll call you if we need to ask you more questions. I said, great. So we left, we turned around, we went back. By the time we got back, there were 5 other patrol cars. All of their lights are on. Both guys handcuffed, face first on the pavement, and they've got a dog going through the car. And we're like, what just happened? Next morning, we turn on the news. The very first thing that's on the news is a story about that car. Well, apparently what happened, 30 minutes before they were arrested, we're watching them be arrested, 30 minutes before that, they had robbed 2 different people at gunpoint, and then they followed us home. So what would have happened if we would have walked into the house? That was God protecting us. And he showed a glimpse of, I'm not letting something happen. So my question, I think about that, my question is, we all suffer bad things in life. Like every single person in here, every person online, we've all felt pain before, and that's going to happen again because we live in a broken world. But what if there are far worse things, and many more of them, that we've never experienced and didn't know that anything happened because God stepped in and protected us? That little story about the people following us, that was just a glimpse of that. I think that kind of stuff happens all the time. So as much as it hurts when we experience loss and pain and suffering, and we ask God to intervene and we trust him in those things, and there's so many other things that don't happen because he stepped in and we have no clue about it, and we won't know about it until the other side of eternity. Like, suffering's real. But here's something that's soothing, is that God will make suffering temporary through redemption. I mean, think about how Ruth suffered. Like, every indication we have is that she was young because Naomi tells her, you can go remarry. So she would have been young. Some of you have lost your spouse. You've lost your wife, you've lost your husband. Some of you have lost your spouse at a young age. I can't think of something more painful. Like that and losing a child, incredibly painful. Like Ruth has experienced that. Now she's got the fear on top of that of, hey, this isn't good for women to be widowed. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. I have nothing. And I'm in a place where I'm a complete outsider. But God redeems that. God redeems her. He puts a stop to the suffering, and then he uses her suffering and her story to bring redemption to the rest of the world. If you follow Jesus, if you claim Jesus as Lord and Savior, if you've been redeemed by him, your redemption came through Ruth's line. That's pretty incredible to think about. And that's what God tends to do. He tends to bring redemption to the masses through perceived misfits, like Ruth. She was a perceived misfit. What's cool is that even though you are not promised immunity to pain, you're not promised immunity, but God will use your pain in a way that it's never in vain, and he will use it to bless you and other people. Like, that's Ruth's story. She experienced a lot of pain, but it was all redeemed. So something that I think is incredibly soothing about Ruth's story is that the significance of your life will go well past your lifetime. That's Ruth. 3,000 years later, and we're still talking about her. I've experienced redemption because of Ruth and her line. And she didn't invent something that changed the world. She didn't have some unique gift set that nobody else in the history of mankind has ever had. No, she was just consistently faithful and kind. That's incredibly significant, and that significance will go well past your lifetime. And then what about security? How did God give her security? Well, very, very up front is he brought Boaz in. And the marriage brought security. But there's still even more to that for us. Isaiah 43 is a chapter that has been a massive encouragement to me over the years, and I can't even begin to tell you how God has used this chapter to shape me. But I want to read you 5 verses, because this just screams security. This is God talking. But now, O Jacob, you could even say God's people. But now, O Jacob, listen to the Lord who created you. O Israel, the one who formed you, who says, do not be afraid, for I've ransomed for you. I've called you by name, you are mine. When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, I will not let you drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I gave Egypt as a ransom for you for your freedom. I gave Ethiopia and Seba in your place. Others were given in exchange for you. I traded lives for yours because you are precious to me. Hear that right now. You are precious to me. You are honored and I love you. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Jesus is the one that was exchanged for us. That's why Christmas is a time of year that is of great peace and joy and comfort, because Isaiah 43, then God has proved that he wasn't a liar. I've called you by name. I'm coming for you. That's Christmas. When you go through chaos, when you go through crisis, when you experience suffering, when you walk through the water, when you walk through the fire, I am with you. Emmanuel, God with us. That's Christmas. I ransomed, I exchanged for your freedom and for your life. That's what was the cross, and the cross wouldn't have happened if Christmas didn't happen. The bottom line is this: Christmas is God is with you. Christmas is God saying, I see you and you matter to me. Christmas is I came to save you so that you are safe and secure. And Christmas is soothing because God is always working, even if it's behind the scenes. So whatever's going on for you right now, it's the most wonderful time of the year, right? But also there's some hard stuff that happens this time of the year. If you're experiencing loss right now, or I have no idea what's going to happen next, or pain, or suffering, or maybe you're just being faithful and kind, whatever it is, Christmas is a promise to you. It's a promise that God is still working behind the scenes. And you may not see it right now. You may not understand why. But if you're faithful, follow her example. If you're faithful, one day you'll see it. That should soothe us. And that should bring some comfort. Because our God has shown this pattern of doing this over and over and over again. If he did it 3,000 years ago with a Moabite who was a misfit, why would he not do it with you? He is. That's why Christmas is a great time of year. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for coming. Thank you for being a God who's always, always, always working behind the scenes, even if we can't see it. Would you just give us faith right now to trust you in that, Lord? that you're working for your glory, you're working for our good, that we just have to be faithful and trust you and follow you. I pray for whatever it looks like for every individual in this room right now and everybody joining us online. You created us with this need to be seen and safe and secure and soothed. Whatever that looks like for every individual in here right now, would you give that to them? And would you give them a hunger to trust you and run to you in it? But give us great joy and encouragement that you are that God that's working behind the scenes. Thank you for your servant, Ruth, for giving us a model to follow. We love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.